Welcome to the deep dive. So you gave us this incredible stack of sources, all focused on a single military event. And it's one of those rare moments in history, a single battle that didn't just, win a war.
No, not at all.
It fundamentally reshaped the entire geopolitical map of Northern and Eastern Europe, almost overnight.
It's an amazing mission to dig into. We talk about empires taking centuries to decline.
Right, a slow fade.
But here, the sources all confirm it. The fate of an entire region was basically decided in a few hours of fighting. It's a story of power shift with huge global implications.
Absolutely. So today, we're doing a deep dive into that very moment. The Battle of Poltava, fought in 1709.
And this wasn't just some chapter in a war.
No.
This was the decisive moment. The culmination of this huge conflict, the Great Northern War, which ran from, 1700 all the way to 1721?
The 21-year war. Wow.
And when we talk about monumental significance, we really mean it. This battle, Poltava, it marked the definitive end of the Swedish Empire's dominance.
An empire that had been the top military dog in the region for a century.
Exactly. And at the same time, it established Tsarist Russia as a new, undeniable European great power. A power that could now project its strength westward.
And you can't talk about this without talking about the commanders. The drama here is incredible. On one side, you have Tsar Peter the Great, completely determined to modernize Russia to get access to the Baltic Sea. And on the other side,
you have King Charles XII of Sweden, the last great warrior king, as he's often called. This is a guy who'd spent a decade just defying and defeating every army sent against him.
So a clash was inevitable. But the outcome, anything but certain.
Not at all.
Okay, let's unpack the setting. We need to lock in the where and the when because the details here matter so much.
So we're looking at July 8th, 1709. It's worth a quick note that you might see June 27th in some sources.
Right, the old calendar versus the new one.
Exactly, Julian versus Gregorian. But either way, the timing is critical. We're in the deep summer of 1709.
And the location, near the town of Poltava, which is deep inside present-day Ukraine.
And that location tells you so much.
It does. The fact that Charles XII's army, the famous Swedish Caroliner, had marched that far south and east, deep into Peter's territory.
It's incredibly audacious.
A high-stakes gamble to just knock Russia out of the war for good.
It was exactly that. A winner-take-all scenario. Look, the war had been dragging on since 1700.
All over control of the Baltic.
Right, over territories like Livonia and Angria, access to ports like Riga and Narva. Peter needed that access. He had to have it to build a navy, to connect Russia to the west.
And Charles had won pretty much all the early battles.
He had, but by 1709, he was stretched thin, very thin.
So let's talk about the leadership on the day, because Peter the Great was there, right, on the field.
He was there, overseeing things, galvanizing his troops, but the direct command of the fighting, that fell to Prince Alexander Menshikov.
One of Peter's most trusted generals.
And a formidable one at that. Now, on the Swedish side, things were complicated.
Because Charles was wounded.
Yes. King Charles was technically in command, but he'd been shot in the foot just weeks before the battle. A serious wound.
So he couldn't lead the charge himself.
No. Which meant field command had to be delegated to Field Marshal Carl Gustav Renskild. And our sources suggest that the physical absence of the king, this charismatic leader, really weighed on the Swedes that day.
It raises a big question then. Was Charles forced into this fight because his supply chain had collapsed? Or was he still confident, still actively seeking this decisive battle?
It seems like a bit of both, really. A combination of desperation and overconfidence. He was running out of supplies. He needed a big win to keep his Cossack allies on board.
And he still believed in the power of that Swedish charge.
He absolutely did. But Peter was ready for him. And this is where you really see Peter's strategic genius, his commitment to modernization, come into play.
Okay, let's transition to the tactics, because this is where the deep dive gets really interesting. It's a clash of two military doctrines.
Precisely. You have the old, dominant Swedish system against this new, modernizing Russian machine.
Peter had spent years reforming his army.
Systematically. He was standardizing weapons, building up domestic factories like the Tula armories. They were pumping out standardized muskets, high-quality artillery.
And Charles, meanwhile,
was relying on a hardened, a very experienced but also very exhausted army that had been on the march for years.
So Peter's position near Poltava was what, a fortress?
He was masterfully prepared. He wasn't going to fight Charles in the open. Peter had constructed this sophisticated, layered defense, and the key feature,
The redoubts.
the redoubts. A line of 10 of these forward defensive forts, just temporary earthen fortifications, but placed perfectly so their cannon and musket fire could overlap.
And they were designed specifically to counter the Swedish charge.
Exactly. To break up that rapid, aggressive, disciplined infantry charge before it could gain any momentum.
So the Swedes launched their attack early in the morning, around 4:30 a.m. The goal is to just blast through these redoubts and hit the main Russian camp.
And they had some initial success.
They did.
A couple of the redoubts fell pretty quickly, which just, confirmed the ferocity of the Caroline attack. But the line held. And this is crucial. The redoubts did their job.
They disrupted the formation.
Completely. The Swedish columns, which were already smaller, got split up, disorganized, and just worn down by the time they pushed through.
And here's where it gets really interesting, because that Swedish charge, which should have been one overwhelming wave,
Right?
it had turned into a series of smaller, confused fights against these forts. So by the time they get through, they aren't facing a disorganized enemy.
No. They're facing Peter's main army, drawn up, waiting for them, fresh.
And the Russian response was overwhelming.
Methodical and overwhelming. I mean, Peter had a huge advantage in numbers. Maybe 42,000 Russian troops to about 19,000 Swedes available for the main fight.
But you said the real difference maker was something else.
It was the artillery.
So quantify that for us. What did that actually look like on the field?
It was night and day. The Russians had over 100 cannon firing into the Swedish ranks. 100.
Wow. And the Swedes?
They had very few heavy guns. It was just too difficult to drag them on that long march. So the ones they had were just completely outmatched. As the Swedes tried to regroup, they were just flattened by this devastating one-sided cannonade.
So it completely neutralized their main advantage, their speed.
Totally. It became a static, grinding battle, and that played right into Peter's hands. They couldn't move, they couldn't flank, they just had to stand there and take it.
So the Swedish tactics, which relied on shock and awe,
They just weren't viable against a prepared, numerically superior, and artillery-heavy defense. The Swedish army basically spent the morning bleeding itself dry.
Okay, let's pivot to the outcome.
Yeah.
Because the numbers are just staggering. This is the aha moment.
It really is.
Yeah.
This wasn't a close fight. It was, for all intents and purposes, an annihilation.
The sources confirmed just catastrophic Swedish losses. On the day of the battle, something like 6,900 soldiers killed or wounded.
And another 2,800 captured. On the spot.
That's nearly 10,000 men gone from an army that was already depleted.
Now compare that to the Russian side, fighting from prepared positions.
What were their losses?
Much, much lower. About 1,300 killed, 3,200 wounded. The Russian army was bruised, sure, but it was intact. The Swedish army was gone.
And the immediate aftermath just sealed the deal a few days later.
The surrender at Pervlakna. The rest of the Swedish forces, about 14,000 men who had retreated, they were cornered and forced to surrender.
That's it. That's the end of the army.
That's often considered the formal end of Sweden as a great power, even though the war went on. And what stands out here is the personal fallout for Charles XII.
Injured, defeated, he had to flee.
He fled with a tiny entourage, crossed the deeper river, and sought refuge in the Ottoman Empire.
I mean, that's almost cinematic. A reigning European king on the run, seeking exile.
And that flight is the ultimate strategic indicator, right? When the leader of a major power flees the continent and his entire army is captured, the power shift isn't just beginning, it's already happened.
So what does this all mean for the big picture? Poltava is 1709. The war ends in 1721 with the Treaty of Nystad. How does this one victory translate into that final treaty?
Poltava gave Peter all the leverage, the moral and military authority to dictate the terms. The next 12 years were basically just sweeping up what was left of Sweden's empire around the Baltic.
And the Treaty of Nystad just made it official.
It consecrated the victory.
And the price for Sweden? What did they lose?
They lost most of their Baltic empire. Ingria, Livonia, Estonia, parts of Karelia, all ceded to Russia. These aren't minor territories. This was the foundation of their empire.
And they were the exact territories Peter needed to realize his dream of a modern maritime Russia?
Exactly. He gained permanent, secure access to the Baltic Sea, and he used it immediately. I mean, we can't forget he had already started building his new capital, St. Petersburg.
On captured Swedish land.
On captured Swedish land. Poltava ensured that St. Petersburg would remain Russia's window to the West. It symbolized Russia's new identity.
It really is the historical pivot point. It ends Sweden's era of dominance and cements the rise of Russia. It's hard to think of another single battle with more profound and rapid consequences.
It truly is.
What a phenomenal shift, all from a single day of fighting. The Battle of Poltava in 1709, it confirmed Russia's ascendancy and just forever changed the map. The material you sent makes it so clear that while the war took 2 decades, the power was irreversibly transferred in a matter of hours.
And the final thought I'd leave you with is about the dual nature of that victory.
How so?
Well, Charles XII forces were legendary for their tactical genius, their offensive spirit. But they were beaten by something else.
By preparation.
Superior Russian preparation, superior logistics, better equipment, and that overwhelming modern artillery park.
It's the difference between relying on the brilliance of one man versus building an institutional, sustainable military machine.
Absolutely. You know, the exile of Charles XII confirms the personal defeat of the king. But the fact that Peter had the capacity, the infrastructure, to keep fighting for another 12 years and enforce that final treaty, that confirms the rise of the state. It just shows how critical preparation is.
The fascinating study in how logistics and firepower, the unglamorous side of war, so often dictate the course of history. Well, thank you for joining us for this deep dive.
And we encourage you to reflect on what Poltava meant for what came next. Think about how securing the Baltic enabled, say, Catherine the Great's foreign policy decades later. It really was a foundational moment.
We'll catch you next time for more deep dives into history, strategy, and power. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're opening up the archives to analyze a single really explosive moment in military history.
July 8th, 1709.
Exactly. The decisive, almost catastrophic clash we know as the Battle of Poltava.
Right.
And, you know, if you're like a lot of people, Poltava might just be a name in a history book. But this deep dive, well, it's your shortcut to understanding a real hinge point. This wasn't just a battle.
No, not at all.
It was the moment that decisively shifted the geopolitical plates of Europe. It crushed Sweden's centuries-long dominance and at the same time forged Russia into the major European power it would become.
You really can't overstate the importance of this. I mean, when we look at Poltava, what we're really looking at is the culmination of this massive conflict.
The Great Northern War.
The Great Northern War, which had been grinding on since 1700. For Peter the Great, this entire war was, well, it was driven by a single critical mission. Russia had to break the tight grip that Sweden held over the Baltic Sea. That coast, that access, it meant everything. Trade, technology, influence. Poltava was the bloody final reckoning for that ambition.
Absolutely. And to truly appreciate the scale of Peter's eventual victory, we have to go back. We have to remember how overwhelmingly successful Sweden was at the start of all this.
Oh, completely.
It's so easy to just focus on the outcome, but the sources make it crystal clear that King Charles XII of Sweden, he began this war with undeniable dominance.
He's a brilliant commander.
Yeah.
Almost a mythological figure in his time.
The boy king, really.
And an astonishingly successful one early on. I mean, just look at the very beginning of the war.
Narva.
The victory at Narva in 1700. Peter the Great's newly formed Russian army, which was much, much larger, was just utterly routed.
Oh, a much smaller force.
A smaller, better drilled professional Swedish force. It was a humiliating, system-shocking defeat for Russia.
So Sweden's initial goal was basically met. They kept control of those vital Baltic territories and, well, they severely embarrassed Russia on the world stage.
They did.
So that brings us to the big question. If Sweden was so dominant after a win like Narva, what exactly was Peter the Great doing in those intervening years?
That's what makes his strategy so defining.
He didn't just try to fight back immediately.
No. Peter's response wasn't denial. It was, this brutal self-assessment and a kind of strategic patience. He realized he could not win the war.
Not then.
Not with the army he had. So he made a very hard choice. He withdrew from direct conflict, pulling back from Poland in 1706, and shifted the entire state's focus to strategic defense and, more importantly, modernization.
He wasn't hiding.
He was forging a new military machine from scratch. Modernization meant adopting European drill, European tactics, and most critically, creating professional regiments.
So like the Preobrazhensky and Semenovsky guards?
Exactly. moving away from those sort of semi-feudal levies that had failed him so badly at Narva. He wasn't just buying muskets, he was building the first true military-industrial base in Russia.
And it was during this exact period, this deliberate withdrawal, that he started building his new capital.
St. Petersburg.
St. Petersburg.
Which is so key to understanding his whole mindset. St. Petersburg wasn't just a construction project, it was a physical manifestation of his ambition to be a European naval power.
A statement.
A huge statement. The whole thing was a signal. Russia was turning its back on its Asian orientation and committing fully to the Baltic, to the West. You can't separate the strategic rebuilding of the army from that geopolitical move.
So that withdrawal and modernization, that's the deep foundation for everything that comes next. It bought him the time he needed.
And the resources.
But then, Charles XII made the fateful decision. In the autumn of 1707, he launches the long-awaited invasion of Russia.
Aiming straight for Moscow.
He thought he was delivering the final decisive blow.
And this is where Charles XII runs head-on into Peter the Great's new counter-strategy. Peter had learned his lesson from Narva.
Which was?
Don't meet Charles XII in a pitched battle on his own terms. Instead, the Russian military adopted this terrifying strategy of total strategic defense.
The scorched earth tactics.
Infamous and brutally effective.
You know, we hear that term scorched earth a lot, but what did it actually mean for the Swedish army on the march?
Well, you have to think of it as psychological warfare wrapped in a logistical nightmare.
Okay.
As the Swedish army advanced, the Russian forces systematically destroyed everything useful in their path. They burned crops, poisoned wells, drove off livestock, dismantled whole villages.
The goal was just to starve them out.
Simple and cruel. Deprive this massive invading force, which needed hundreds of tons of supplies every single day, of everything it needed to survive deep inside hostile territory. Every day the Swedes marched further, their supply lines got thinner, and the landscape just got more barren.
And they were being harassed the whole time.
Constantly. By smaller, fast-moving Russian forces that just refused to engage in a big battle. The sources show that by late 1707, the Swedish army was already running on fumes.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting for me. Because it wasn't just a smart, deliberate human strategy that broke the Swedish army.
No, it wasn't.
These logistical hardships were violently amplified by a factor completely outside of anyone's control.
That's the part that is so often glossed over, but it had a monumental impact. The destruction caused by the Russians was dramatically intensified by the environmental conditions of the winter of 1708-1709.
The Great Frost.
The Great Frost. And we're not just talking about a harsh winter here. You need to understand, this was an unprecedented climatic disaster across all of Europe.
An ice age winter.
Precisely. Sources from the time describe it as a cataclysmic deep freeze. The Baltic Sea froze solid. Casualties among the Swedish ranks from cold and starvation reached just devastating numbers.
What are we talking, like a few thousand?
We're talking about estimates ranging up to a third of their entire fighting strength, lost before the summer campaign even began.
A third of the army, gone.
Imagine it. You're marching toward Moscow, suffering surprise attacks, running out of supplies because the land is burned, and then you're hit with temperatures so low that muskets literally freeze and entire units just perish overnight in their camps.
So the Great Frost, it becomes this kind of non-negotiable partner in Peter's strategy.
It absolutely does. It decimated the Swedish forces before they even got near a major fight, providing the ultimate validation of the scorched earth policy.
So by the spring of 1709, the mighty Swedish army is starving, freezing, and dramatically smaller.
They simply could not maintain the push toward Moscow. It was impossible.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Charles XII faced an insurmountable strategic problem.
A crisis. He needed resources and reinforcements, and he needed them immediately.
And that logistical crisis forced this dramatic, desperate pivot south, away from Moscow.
And into Ukraine.
Which brings us to Ivan Mazepa, one of the most controversial figures in this whole conflict.
Absolutely.
Charles XII needs a local alliance, and he finds Mazepa, the Cossack hetman. This was a high-risk, high-reward move.
To understand Mazepa's decision, you really have to understand the political tension at the time. Mazepa wasn't necessarily a traitor to Russia, not in his own mind.
He was a regional leader.
A regional leader trying to preserve Cossack autonomy. And Peter the Great, as part of his whole modernization and centralization project, was systematically stripping away the traditional self-governance the Cossacks enjoyed.
So Mazepa felt his back was against the wall.
He saw this alliance with Charles XII as maybe the only way to protect his own position and the independence of the host against Peter's iron fist.
So the deal was struck. Mazeppa promised to bring a substantial force. I think the sources mention up to 30,000 Cossacks.
That was the number, yes. In exchange for Swedish protection against those very centralizing reforms Peter was pushing through.
This was Charles's big hope.
It was his attempt to inject fresh troops and, just as important, local knowledge into his campaign. But
it didn't work out.
Mazeppa could only deliver a fraction of that number. Peter moved very quickly to crush Mazeppa's base of support. So even with the alliance, the Swedish situation remained dire. They were low on troops, low on supplies, and they needed a win.
And that desperation leads directly to the siege of Poltava by May 1709. Why there? Why commit the last of your energy to this one spot?
Poltava was strategically critical. The sources highlight that it was a crucial trading center, but more importantly, it was a major Russian military depot.
So it was full of supplies.
Exactly. Capturing it would have given the severely depleted Swedes the provisions, the ammunition, everything they desperately needed. Charles XII was making this huge existential bet that he could crack Poltava before Peter could assemble his new army for the final showdown.
He bet wrong.
Very wrong.
Because while the Swedes were starving and laying siege, Peter the Great wasn't sitting still. We now see the convergence of the armies, the final move.
Peter moved decisively to relieve that siege, and he assembled an army that just absolutely dwarfed the invaders.
The numerical imbalance at this point is just shocking. It really speaks volumes about how successful Peter's long-term strategy had been.
It does. You had the Swedish forces weakened and confined to the siege works, and they were facing a modernized, well-drilled Russian army, estimated at a monumental 75 to 80,000 men.
80,000.
Fully supplied and ready to fight.
Which raises the obvious question, how could the Swedish army even think about engaging against those kinds of odds?
Well, they had to rely on a rapid, decisive strike, the kind of thing that has worked for them in the past. But the strategic advantage they once held was just completely gone.
And then there's the final twist of fate.
The injury. Complicating everything further, just days before the battle, Charles XII was wounded. A shot to the foot.
Meaning he couldn't personally lead the charge?
Which was devastating. That attack had to be led by his subordinates who lacked the king's authority, his tactical genius, his ability to coordinate on the fly.
So on the day of the battle itself, what went wrong? What was the moment the whole Swedish gamble just collapsed?
The Russian general staff, knowing they had the numbers, had set up a classic, modern defensive position. Peter constructed a series of 6 crucial redoubts. These are earthen fortifications outside Poltava.
A trap.
A killing zone. The Swedish advance had to pass through a narrow channel between these redoubts to even reach the main Russian camp. The Swedish cavalry, renowned for their aggressive charges, got completely trapped in this gauntlet.
It just fell apart.
The uncoordinated attack, slowed by the redoubts, simply disintegrated under heavy Russian artillery and coordinated infantry fire. The Swedes, weakened by years of campaigning and lacking that central command, were just overwhelmed. Overwhelmed by the sheer mass and the modern discipline of the Russian forces.
So those numbers on the day, they tell the whole story of the previous 2 years, don't they?
They really do.
They show the damage done by logistics, by weather, and by Peter's patient modernization. So the confrontation wasn't just a day of fighting.
No, it was the inevitable, brutal climax. It's where the long struggle for Baltic dominance and the devastating realities of invading this massive territory in a harsh climate all converged. Everything Peter the Great had worked toward, building that stronger army, weathering the initial defeats, implementing that harsh but effective scorched earth policy. It was all validated. Decisively on that field. The battle ended not just with a defeat, but with the total annihilation and capture of most of the surviving Swedish forces. Charles XII himself barely escaped,
fleeing south into Ottoman territory. So let's pull back. What does this all mean for the big picture of European history?
Poltava fundamentally redefined the regional and really the global order. You can kind of summarize the outcome by looking at 3 major geopolitical elements. First, it was the definitive end of the Swedish Empire as a major European power. It shrank their influence right back to the Scandinavian peninsula.
And second,
it was the ultimate success story of Russian strategic defense and modernization. It proved Peter the Great could transform his nation into a truly European military power, capable of projecting force through the Baltic.
And the third piece.
And third, it deeply solidified the struggle for control over Ukraine. By crushing Mazeppa and the Cossack host, Peter firmly cemented Ukraine into the Russian sphere. And that set up political and cultural tensions that, as we know, continue to echo through the centuries.
So the Battle of Poltava, it really wasn't just a military victory. It was the ultimate validation of Peter's whole strategic shift.
Withdrawing, modernizing, and weathering the elements.
It permanently altered the political map of Europe and fulfilled Peter's vision for Russia as a dominant Baltic-facing state.
It did.
But, it just leaves me with this one last thought. A final provocative thought for you to consider, based on our sources today. How much of this massive shift in global power, the rise of Russia, the fall of Sweden, was ultimately decided not by the tactical brilliance of a single general in the heat of the moment, but by the strategic use of geography and the devastating, uncontrollable impact of the Great Frost of 1708-1709.
It's a powerful thought.
It makes you think about how these environmental disasters can be the invisible, silent partners in reshaping the destinies of entire empires.
A powerful reminder that sometimes the terrain and the climate are a nation's most effective defense.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the turning point of the Great Northern War. We'll see you next time. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are really opening up the military history playbook.
We certainly are.
We're going to analyze a battle that, it just irrevocably changed the map of Europe. The Battle of Poltava in 1709.
That's right. And it's so fascinating because for centuries, the Swedish Carolingian army under Charles XII was seen as, virtually invincible.
Right. They had this reputation.
They did. They relied on this extreme discipline and speed, these shock tactics designed to just break an enemy before they could really get off enough effective volleys.
So our mission today for you is to get into the specific, minute details of how the Russian military, which was, still pretty new by European standards,
super evolving,
how they blended that evolving doctrine with these crucial adaptations to nullify that seemingly unstoppable Swedish charge.
Exactly.
And what makes this deep dive so valuable is that we aren't just talking about, sheer numbers winning the day. We are looking at a fundamental clash of doctrines.
A clash of philosophies, really.
And it starts not with the fighting, but with the painstaking work of preparing the battlefield.
Exactly. Peter the Great understood something fundamental. To defeat a fast, highly motivated shock army, you can't
meet them head on.
You can't. You have to slow them down. You have to bleed them before they can even reach your main line. So the foundation for this victory at Poltava was it was built weeks ahead of time.
Through fortifications.
Through methodical defensive preparations, a massive system of field fortifications constructed all around the Russian positions.
10 forts. That just sounds like an incredible undertaking. How quickly did they build these? And the shape, the sources, point to this critical T-shape. What made that formation such a game changer?
Well, the effort was monumental. You're talking about weeks of continuous labor, thousands of men, all while the Swedish army is right there maneuvering nearby.
Wow.
And that T-shape, it wasn't arbitrary at all. It was genius. Imagine a long line, 6 redoubts running parallel to the direction of the Swedish advance. That's the spine. Then a perpendicular set of 4 redoubts extends out. And that creates what historians call a critical killing field.
So if the Swedes wanted to reach the main Russian camp, they couldn't just swing around it. They had to thread the needle.
Precisely. The redoubts were placed just close enough that they created these interlocking fields of fire. So the Swedes were forced to break their pristine formations into smaller columns to get through the gaps.
But the real genius is that crossbar of the T, isn't it?
That's the masterstroke. Because as the Swedish columns advanced through that parallel line, they were simultaneously exposed to just brutal enfilading fire.
Flanking fire.
Flanking artillery and musket fire from the redoubts placed at the ends of that T.
That is an immediate, massive psychological and, physical toll before the main fight even begins. But wait a second. Wouldn't exposing the flanks of that T-shape make those individual forts really vulnerable?
That's a sharp question.
I mean, to a concentrated Swedish cavalry attack trying to swing wide around the whole thing.
And that's where Peter's coordination comes in, which, we'll get to. But the redoubts themselves, they were designed as defensible squares, heavily supported by field artillery. So they had strong, short-range defensive capability.
But their main goal wasn't just to hold out forever.
No, not at all. Their primary goal was attrition and disruption. By the time the Swedish columns had navigated that deadly T-maze, their ranks were already thinned, their formations were a mess, and that vital momentum, it was gone.
Okay, the foundation is set. The fortifications dictate the terms of the fight, and they absorb that crucial Swedish shock advantage. So now we get to the actual fighting engine. the Russian infantry.
Right.
They eventually had to leave the shelter of the redoubts. So how are they formed up to face the enemy, and how did they shift from being a static defense to, well, an aggressive offensive force?
So on the main battle line, the Russian infantry used the standard four-rank battalion formations. Pretty popular in Europe at the time.
Dutch or English firing systems, right?
Generally, yes. Which meant discipline in volley firing was absolutely key. Now, in the early 18th century, we still see a mix of weapons. Muskets are dominant, of course, but what about the older shock weapon, the pike? How did Peter fit that into these seemingly modernized formations?
Well, the majority were musket-armed, yes, delivering those coordinated volleys, either rank by rank or by platoon. But the pikes, they were concentrated right in the center of the formation.
Like an insurance policy.
Exactly, the ultimate insurance policy. Initially, they reinforced the line defensively against any desperate Swedish cavalry breakthroughs. But their true value in this new Russian doctrine was actually offensive.
And this is where the analysis gets really insightful, because the Russians didn't just stand and shoot defensively until the Swedes broke.
Not at all.
They fundamentally changed the nature of the fight. They became an aggressive shock force themselves. How do you pull that off? Blending a disciplined European volley fire system with a shock charge. This is the Poltava doctrine in a nutshell. And it's what separated them. The heralding method was simple. Charge fast, fire maybe one or two volleys, and rely on the bayonet or sword to win the melee.
Right, speed and steel.
Peter turned that right back against them. The Russian tactic was to advance, deliver one lethal, concentrated volley, and then immediately follow up with a charge using bayonets.
Hold on, if the Swedes were famous for that high-speed charge, wouldn't shifting the Russian infantry from measured defensive fire into a bayonet charge be incredibly risky? I mean, doesn't that undermine the very discipline Peter had spent years building?
It was a calculated risk, yeah.
Yeah.
And it was based on a single vital metric. Distance.
Okay.
They weren't charging from 100 meters away. They were closing to an extremely short distance. We're talking 15 to 20 meters.
That close.
That close. Before delivering that volley. Now, if you think about an 18th century smoothbore musket, it's wildly inaccurate past 50 meters. By closing to 15, that Russian volley became a guaranteed lethal impact that just shredded the Swedish front ranks.
So you're basically using the musket as a giant shotgun to blast a hole in their formation right before your own bayonet charge arrives to exploit it.
Precisely. The volley wasn't meant to just hurt the enemy. It was meant to cause maximum disruption and shock right at the moment of contact. And those pikes we mentioned.
Yeah.
They added immensely to the shock of that charge. Used offensively in the melee, they created this visual wall, this psychological deterrent. It often caused enemy ranks to break and run before any actual physical contact was even made.
Now let's focus on the tactical evolution that pushed this over the edge in 1709. The sources are clear that the measured march was abandoned. The infantry adopted a running advance.
Yes, that speed adjustment was absolutely critical. In earlier fights, Peter's troops had sometimes struggled. That slow, measured march was a problem when facing the incredibly fast Swedish approach.
So they drilled.
By 1709, they had drilled relentlessly. They replaced that slow advance with a running movement over the final stretch. This cut down the time the Russians spent exposed to incoming fire, but more importantly, it enhanced the overall shock effect when they delivered that volley and immediately crashed into the Swedes.
That is such a fundamental change. Taking a disciplined European system, adding that close-range lethality, and then accelerating the whole thing to beat the enemy at their own game.
It shows Peter was willing to break tradition to find what worked.
Absolutely. But as you alluded to earlier, no army wins with infantry alone. We have to look at the coordinated arms. How did the supporting elements integrate to create that flexibility and ensure the infantry wasn't just left exposed?
This is the true hallmark of a modern army, isn't it? Integrated arms. If we connect this back, coordination was paramount, especially with the artillery.
Right beyond the redoubts.
Exactly. While the redoubts provided static firepower in the open field, the Russian artillery was maneuvered aggressively to disrupt those fearsome Swedish attack columns.
And what was the specific technical advantage the Russian gunners had?
It was a tactical shift in ammunition. The Russian artillery became expert at switching to grape and canister shot at extremely close range.
So not solid cannonballs.
Well, solid shot was for long-distance effect. But grape and canister, which, sprays hundreds of metal balls out of the cannon like a giant shotgun shell, it is absolutely lethal to packed infantry.
We hear about grape shot all the time, but paint a picture for us. How close did the Swedish lines have to get for that to be effective?
They needed the enemy to be within, say, 200 to 300 yards for canister to be truly devastating against dense formations. And it required phenomenal nerve from the gunners.
They had to wait.
They had to hold their fire, waiting until that Swedish mass was bearing down on them, fully committed to the charge. That switch point from round shot to shrapnel was a calculated risk that paid off by just annihilating the coherence of the Swedish formations moments before they could hit the Russian line.
Okay, that's the heavy firepower. Then you have the hybrid forces, the dragoons. They sound like the multi-tools of the early modern army.
Absolutely. The Russian dragoons were incredibly versatile. They were mounted infantry, equipped with muskets, pistols, and sabers. They could fight mounted for speed or dismounted as high-quality infantry.
So mobile firepower wherever you needed it.
Exactly. And their key roles went beyond just fighting. They were the strategic eyes and muscle of the operation leading up to the battle.
Scouting.
Long-range scouting, critical for intelligence. And before Poltava, they were instrumental in executing Peter's scorched earth tactics.
Right.
By moving rapidly across the countryside, they denied forage, provisions, resources, everything to the advancing Swedish army. They were essentially starving the enemy while harassing their flanks constantly.
So they're denying the Swedes the ability to sustain themselves, which reduces their combat capability even before the main battle is joined.
That's their vital strategic role. Meanwhile, the main Russian cavalry force, led by Prince Menshikov, operated as a pure exploiting force.
What do you mean by that?
They didn't engage in long frontal slugging matches. Instead, they executed these rapid flanking maneuvers. They would explicitly wait and then charge into Swedish formations only after those formations had been disrupted by artillery or stalled by the redoubts.
So they weren't just a reserve waiting to be unleashed. They were synchronized with the infantry and the cannons. They were there to maximize the chaos.
They were the hammer, exploiting the openings created by the combined efforts of the fortifications and the cannon fire anvil. By using them so flexibly, Peter ensured that every Russian action supported another. The Swedes never got a chance to rally or reform.
It's a remarkable level of planning. So if we put all the pieces together for you, the overall tactical picture is this system built on attrition and shock. You have the immovable object, those T-shaped redoubts, working with the irresistible force, that running bayonet charging infantry.
Supported by extremely flexible dragoons and a capitalizing cavalry. The synthesis is unmistakable.
A method that combined methodical defensive prep,
which stalled and chewed up the Swedes,
with concentrated firepower delivered at the most effective range possible. That 15-meter volley.
And the crucial flexible use of mobile forces to ensure the Swedes had no respite, no safe flank to rest on.
And crucially, this specific blend just completely offset the Swedes' established strengths.
It did. The Swedes relied on closing fast to overwhelm the enemy before musketry could break them. Peter the Great simply made their approach deadly through engineering and artillery, and then adopted an equally, if not more aggressive, running infantry charge once they were inside that lethal range.
A tactical counterpunch.
A technological and tactical counterpunch that delivered the decisive victory at Poltava and confirmed Russia as the new major power in the north.
It's truly amazing, the level of planning and the speed of adaptation. So to wrap this up, the surprising efficacy of the Russian military here really lay in combining their strict, very static defensive works with the most aggressive running infantry shock tactics of the era.
They didn't just copy the West.
No, they optimized those tactics for their specific enemy and for maximum lethal impact.
And this raises, I think, a really important question for you to consider long after this deep dive is finished. How much of Russia's success at Poltava relied on the technical evolution of their firing systems, that ability to deliver synchronized volleys and coordinated grape shot, versus the purely psychological impact of that running close-range charge with the pikes?
Technology versus psychology.
Right. The fact that Peter the Great could so quickly and fundamentally adapt his army's doctrine in the face of the fearsome Carolean model is a profound testament to the pace of military thought in the early 18th century. Something certainly worth mulling over.
Absolutely. We've unpacked the formations and the strategy that shifted the global power balance. Now you know exactly how the Great Northern War was decided, detail by detail. Thank you for diving deep with us.
Welcome, listener. Today we're doing a deep dive into a single brutal military engagement. One that didn't just win a war, it fundamentally redesigned the geopolitical architecture of Northern Europe. And we're going to cut straight past the grand tactical maneuvers and really focus on the raw data.
Right, the numbers.
Exactly. The casualty figures that show you precisely when one empire failed and another one was, well, truly born. Our mission today is to see how the cold, hard math of death, wounding, and capture is basically a shortcut to historical understanding. We're talking about the Battle of Poltava, fought in the summer of 1709. This was the decisive clash of the Great Northern War. Okay, let's unpack this.
You really have to understand Poltava if you want to get the modern history of Eastern Europe. It's, as you said, the definitive moment. It confirmed the end of Sweden's empire, and, it marked the real arrival of Peter the Great's Russia on the European stage. And we can see this massive shift just by breaking down the losses on both sides.
So let's start with the side that lost everything. The Swedish army under King Charles XII was, at this point, maybe the most professional, formidable fighting force in Europe. So when you look at the figures for their loss at Poltava, it doesn't just read like a defeat, it's a catastrophic amputation. During the fighting itself, the immediate figures our sources give suggest approximately 6,900 Swedish soldiers were killed or wounded.
Which is just a staggering number.
A staggering casualty rate for a single engagement, yeah. It instantly debilitated their ability to fight. Here's where it gets really interesting, though.
It is, but to really grasp the scale of the collapse, you have to move beyond the killed and wounded. You have to look at the capture figures. This is where a bad defeat just accelerates into an irreversible rout.
Okay, so what do the sources say there?
Our sources confirm that an additional 2,800 soldiers were taken prisoner by the Russians. And we're not just talking about, 2,800 random infantrymen. These were the remaining highly trained professional regulars. They were the core strength and experience of the entire Swedish army.
So, essentially irreplaceable.
Absolutely irreplaceable.
So when you combine those figures, the killed, wounded, and then the captured, the total combat losses for the Swedes, it gets up over 9,600 men?
It does, over 9,600.
And this force was the spearhead of their entire empire. So what does the source material tell us about the impact of losing that many?
The sources are completely unequivocal. They stress that this was the near destruction of their fighting force in one battle. Losing that number of elite soldiers and officers, especially through capture, meant Sweden's ability to project power to sustain its empire. It was just gone.
Destroyed in a single afternoon.
Exactly. It wasn't just a retreat, it was a complete annihilation of their strategic capacity.
That's a crucial distinction. The loss of 9,600 irreplaceable men signals the end of an empire's dominance. But victory, of course, always comes at a price. So let's pivot to the victorious Russian side. What was the cost of this decisive triumph for Tsar Peter the Great?
Right, because it wasn't a clean victory by any means.
No, not at all. And when we look at the numbers for the Russian losses, there's an immediate numerical surprise waiting for you. The estimates for Russian soldiers killed actually range around 9,234.
And that's a powerful point. Wait, so just to be clear, the Russian death toll was numerically higher than the Swedish killed and wounded count combined.
Yes, 9,234 Russian killed versus 6,900 Swedes killed and wounded.
So how can we even classify this as a decisive victory for Peter? I mean, why wasn't the Russian force also considered functionally eliminated?
That is the core question, isn't it? If we were just counting bodies, the victory doesn't look nearly as clear-cut.
Not at all. And the answer really lies in the strategic depth and the reserve capacity of the two empires in 1709. Sweden was fighting far from home. They had a small professional army that relied on quality over quantity.
Right.
So losing 9,600 men meant they were basically out of gas. They had no reserves. Russia, on the other hand, was fighting on its own turf with this massive, newly modernized army that was built for attrition.
Peter the Great had the manpower to absorb that loss.
He did. He could absorb a loss of over 9,000 killed and, still keep fighting the next day. For Russia, it was a very costly price. For Sweden, it was terminal. But again, we have to look at the prisoner numbers to really see the turning point. The sources say that somewhere between 2,864 and 2,977 Russian troops were captured by the Swedes.
So on the face of it, the captured numbers are remarkably similar, around 2,800, maybe 2,900 on both sides. Yet one set of those numbers means utter devastation, and the other is just a footnote in a triumph in history. Why is that?
Well, this is the nuance that makes the data so fascinating. The sources actually mention that the figure for Russian prisoners is less emphasized.
Less emphasized.
Yeah, precisely because of the ultimate decisive Russian victory. Just think about what that implies about battlefield cohesion. The Swedish army, by losing over 2,800 men as prisoners in a single surrender, which got them to that fatal 9,600 total, clearly suffered a catastrophic breakdown of command. of morale. They were routed. The Russian army, even though it suffered a huge number of fatalities, maintained its strategic cohesion. They held together.
And they captured the core of the Swedish army.
Exactly. And they dictated the outcome. So the loss of their own prisoners, while tragic, didn't stop them from winning the war. It just confirmed their superior strategic sustainability.
So it tells you that the real measure of success isn't just who suffered the most casualties. It's about who suffered the most irreplaceable casualties. The mass capture of those elite Swedish regulars, that sealed the deal.
That's it.
So we have these two sets of figures: the high cost of Russian victory, the terminal cost of Swedish defeat. Let's get to the ultimate so what for you, the listener. How did these specific losses fundamentally rewrite the map of Europe?
Well, the implications were immediate, and they were frankly global in scope. The heavy Swedish losses at Poltava confirmed what was already happening, but it crystallized it in one afternoon. The rapid and irreversible decline of Sweden as a dominant military power. For centuries, Sweden had held so much sway over the Baltic Sea and Northern Europe. Poltava just shattered that. It led directly to the loss of Swedish territories, diminishing their strategic presence in the east. This was the moment the Swedish Empire essentially stepped off the stage of major European power politics.
And of course, history abhors a vacuum. That 9,600-man loss paved the way for the new power to step right in.
Precisely. The battle decisively shifted the balance of power. It ensured Russia's emergence as a permanent, major player in the European system. Peter the Great's ambitions to, open a window to Europe and secure Russia's access to the Baltic, they were all validated by this one military success.
It wasn't just about territory then.
No, it also secured Russia's legitimacy as a European imperial power that could defeat the continent's strongest military.
And it all comes back to that contrast in the numbers. Understanding that the 9,600 Swedish losses meant near destruction because of the quality of the troops and the huge number of prisoners, while the 9,234 Russian fatalities, though higher, were sustainable for a massive empire. That is the shortcut to understanding a 300-year geopolitical change.
It really is.
Poltava is such a powerful lesson that numerical details, they solidify historical narratives so much better than sweeping generalizations ever could. The fate of empires turned on the difference between 6,900 men killed and wounded and an extra 2,800 men captured.
And that strategic emphasis on the captured figures is the final piece of nuance really worth thinking about. Considering the Russian death count was so much higher than the Swedish killed and wounded count, the fact that our sources make such a point of the substantial loss of Swedish manpower and prisoners tells you everything.
It tells you where the breaking point was.
Exactly. It tells you where the psychological and military breaking point truly was. That sheer act of a mass surrender, turning 2,800 surviving soldiers into strategic liabilities, that's what transformed a costly fight into a decisive, irreversible rout. That mass surrender, that collapse of cohesion, that is the true numerical tipping point of Poltava.
Absolutely. The destiny of empires often lies hidden in the specific numerical breakdown of a battle, a fascinating deep dive into how data informs power. Listener, we will catch you on the next exploration.